The snow had just begun to fall when my daughter pulled on her boots without a word. By the time I reached the door, a stranger was already waiting at the edge of our field. I raised my daughter alone in a quiet house at the end of a winter road, where the snow erased tracks faster than questions could form. We had lived that way for years, careful, contained, never inviting the past too close. That morning, with the light still blue and thin, something we had kept buried walked back into our lives without knocking. The snow had fallen quietly overnight, the kind that doesn't wake you, but changes everything by morning. I stood at the kitchen sink with my hands wrapped around a mug that had already gone cold. The window above the sink was fogged from the heat, and I wiped a circle clear with my sleeve. That was when I felt it. Not panic, not fear, just a thin absence moving through the house. The clock kept ticking. The floor stayed still. I called her name once, softly, the way you do when you expect an answer to come back right away. It didn't. I looked down the hallway. Her door was open. The bed was made, too neat for this time of morning. Her boots were gone from the mat by the door. That was when I turned back to the window. The porch was white, untouched, clean in a way that made my chest tighten. Then I saw them. 2 narrow lines pressed into the snow, beginning right at our door. Footprints. Small. Careful. Hers. They moved straight ahead, not wandering, not hesitating. Just forward. Already softening at the edges, the snow slowly filling them back in, as if the ground were trying to forget she'd been there. I didn't grab my coat. I didn't lock the door. I stepped outside, the cold biting through my socks, and followed the prints off the porch. My breath came out louder than I expected. Each step I took felt too heavy, like I might crush whatever meaning she'd left behind. I called her name again. Louder this time. The sound disappeared into the open field without echo, the kind of quiet that doesn't answer back. The field stretched wide and pale, the fence cutting across it like a sentence that hadn't been finished. The snow was still falling, light and steady, enough to blur the distance. I could see her ahead of me then, a small shape near the far fence. She wasn't alone. A man stood beside her. Tall, still. His coat hung loose on his shoulders, darker than the morning, like he didn't belong to the landscape. My steps slowed without me deciding to stop. Something in the way they stood together held me back. She didn't look afraid. That was the first thing I noticed. Her hands were in her pockets. Her shoulders relaxed. She was listening. Not the way children listen when they're being told what to do, but the way someone listens when they already know the answer. The man didn't move when he saw me. He didn't wave or step back. He just turned his head slightly, like he'd expected me to come. I stopped a few feet away. The fence creaked in the wind, wood rubbing against wire. The sound felt older than all of us. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked her. She didn't look at me right away. Her eyes stayed on the field, on the snow settling into the places her feet had already been. "I didn't know how," she said. Her voice was steady. Too steady. The man shifted his weight then, boots sinking slightly into the snow. His hands were open at his sides, palms red from the cold. He looked at me with something like care, but not apology. I asked his name. He said it quietly, like he wasn't sure he was allowed to say it out loud. The sound of it landed between us, and stayed there. I felt it before I understood it. The way you recognize a smell before you remember where it came from. My daughter glanced at me then. Just once. Long enough to see if I would run. I didn't. The snow kept falling. Soft. Patient. "I saw him before," she said. "Weeks ago. By the fence." I pictured the field in the late afternoons, the way the light goes thin and blue just before dark. I'd never thought to look twice. "He never crossed," she went on. "He just stood there." The man nodded slightly, like she'd told it right. Asked her why she followed him today. She shrugged. A small movement. Almost nothing. "He waited," she said. "So, I thought maybe I should too." The fence groaned again. Somewhere far off, a bird lifted and disappeared into the gray sky. I wanted to tell her she should have woken me, that she should have said something, that children don't walk into fields with strangers in the snow. But none of those words felt like they belonged here. Instead, I looked at the man's face. The lines around his eyes. The way he held himself just slightly apart, even standing so close. Like someone who had practiced keeping distance. "You shouldn't have come," I said. He didn't argue. "I know." My daughter's breath caught then. Just a little. She shifted closer to him, without touching. "He's family," she said. The word hung there, fragile as frost. I felt the cold then, finally. It spread up through my legs, into my chest. I wrapped my arms around myself, more out of habit than warmth. Family. The word has a way of opening doors you thought were sealed shut. I thought of the drawer in my bedroom, the one that stayed closed. The photographs folded inward. The names I didn't say. I thought of how children see more than we think they do. How silence teaches its own lessons. The man looked at my daughter again. There was something unfinished in his eyes. Something careful. "I won't stay," he said. "I just needed her to see me." She nodded. Like this was something they'd already discussed. The snow began to thicken then, the field slowly losing its edges. The footprints behind me were almost gone. I reached out and touched my daughter's sleeve. She was warm, solid. "Here. Come inside," I said. She hesitated. Just a second. Then she shook her head. "Not yet." The man stepped back toward the fence. He stopped where the wire marked the line he wouldn't cross. He looked at me then, really looked at me. "I waited," he said again. Not as an excuse. Just a fact. I didn't answer. I didn't know how. My daughter watched him go, her face quiet, unreadable. When he turned away, his footprints filled in almost immediately, the snow smoothing the ground like it had never been disturbed. She stood there a moment longer. Then she turned back to me. "I didn't mean to scare you," she said. I nodded. The words felt too small for what they were carrying. We walked back toward the house together. Her steps beside mine. The field already erasing where we'd been. When we reached the porch, I looked back once. The fence stood empty. The snow kept falling. Inside, the clock was still ticking. The house felt different now. Not quieter. Just awake. I didn't ask her any more questions. Not yet. The snow hadn't stopped, but it had slowed enough to let sound return to the world. I could hear the wind again. The wire fence ticking softly as it tightened in the cold. Somewhere behind us, the house made a small settling sound, like it had been listening and finally shifted its weight. He said his name. It was quiet, almost careful, but it landed hard. It was a name I hadn't spoken out loud in years. Not in the house. Not to myself. Not even in my head without quickly replacing it with something safer. Hearing it again felt like stepping into a room I'd sealed shut and finding the air still warm. My daughter flinched before I did. Just a small movement, her shoulders tightening, her jaw setting, but I saw it. She knew it was coming. She had been waiting for that sound the way you wait for thunder after a flash of light. I looked at her. She didn't look back. The man lowered his eyes after saying it, like he'd finished something difficult. His breath came out slow, pale in the cold. He didn't rush to explain himself. He didn't add anything to the name, as if trusting it to carry its own weight. I felt the silence close in around us. Not empty silence. Arranged silence. The kind that has been practiced. "Where did you come from?" I asked. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. I noticed that before I noticed how my hands had curled into fists inside my coat sleeves. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his head slightly and glanced toward the woods that bordered the far edge of the field. The trees stood dark and close together, their branches heavy with snow. No path visible. No movement. Just a thick wall of quiet. "There," he said finally. Just one word. It wasn't an answer. It was a direction. I waited for more. He didn't give it. My daughter shifted beside me, her boots scraping softly against the packed snow. She still hadn't looked at me. Her eyes were fixed on the woods too, as if something there had already been explained to her. I felt something tighten in my chest then. Not anger, not fear, but the slow understanding that this conversation had started long before I arrived. How long? I asked her. She hesitated, counted something silently, then shrugged. Long enough. The fence creaked again, louder this time, the sound cutting through the pause. I stepped closer without realizing it, like proximity might give me something solid to hold on to. You talked to him, I said. It wasn't a question. She nodded. Once. Not like that, she said quickly. He didn't tell stories. He just answered things. I looked at the man. He met my eyes for the first time then. There was no challenge there. No expectation. Just a kind of readiness, like he had prepared himself to be seen and accepted whatever followed. What things? I asked. She took a breath. Let it out slowly. Things you don't like to talk about. The snow continued to fall, light but steady, filling the space between us. It felt wrong that something so ordinary could be happening while my past stood in front of me wearing a stranger's face. I remembered the last time I'd heard that name spoken. A different season. No snow. A door closing too hard. The sound of footsteps leaving and not coming back. I had learned how to live around that absence. Built a life that didn't ask questions. My daughter hadn't had that choice. The man shifted his weight, boots sinking slightly into the snow. He looked uncomfortable now, not guilty, just aware. Like he knew he'd stepped into something fragile. I didn't mean to interfere, he said. His voice was low. Even. The kind of voice that doesn't try to convince you. She asked, he continued, nodding toward my daughter. I answered. I wanted to tell him that children ask the wrong questions all the time. That adults are supposed to protect them from answers they aren't ready for. But looking at her, standing there with her shoulders squared against the cold, I wasn't sure that applied. What did you tell her? I asked. He paused. Long enough to be honest. I told her why I left, he said. And why I stayed gone. My daughter finally looked at me then. Her eyes weren't accusing. They were searching. I realized how long it had been since she'd looked at me that way. The woods stood silent behind him, holding whatever pieces of the story hadn't been spoken yet. I felt the urge to fill the space, to say something, anything that might pull us back into safer ground. Instead, I asked, and what did she say? A small smile touched his mouth. Not happiness. Recognition. She didn't ask me to explain myself, he said. She just asked if I was cold. My daughter's cheeks flushed slightly. She looked down at her boots. He was shaking, she said. I thought maybe no one had noticed. The words landed quietly, but they cut deep. I thought of all the things I hadn't noticed because I'd trained myself not to look. The snow thickened again, the field growing softer, edges blurring. The world narrowing to the three of us and the space between our breaths. I stepped back, creating distance without meaning to. The fence pressed lightly into my coat. How much do you know? I asked her. She didn't answer right away. She looked past me, toward the house, its windows pale against the gray sky. I know enough, she said. And not everything. That felt fairer than it should have. The man glanced toward the woods again, then back at us. I should go, he said. He sounded certain this time, like he'd reached the end of whatever he'd come to do. My daughter turned toward him, surprised. Already? He nodded. I said what I needed to say. She swallowed. I saw her fingers curl inside her pockets. Will you come back? She asked. He hesitated. Not because he didn't want to answer, but because he knew the weight of the question. If you ask me to, he said. She looked at me then. I felt the moment press in, asking something of me I hadn't prepared for. The snow continued its quiet work, settling onto the fence, the field, the past. I need time, I said. It wasn't a refusal. It wasn't permission. It was the truth. The man nodded, accepting it without comment. He took a step backward, stopping at the fence line, careful not to cross it. My daughter watched him go, her face unreadable. When he turned toward the woods, his footprints appeared briefly in the snow, then softened, fading as he moved farther away. Soon, there was nothing left but white. She stood beside me for a long moment. Neither of us spoke. I didn't mean to keep secrets, she said finally. I looked at her. Really looked at her. The way the cold had pinked her cheeks. the steadiness in her eyes. "I know," I said. We turned back toward the house together, our steps side by side. Behind us, the snow erased the last of the footprints. The woods stayed quiet. But I knew now, they had already spoken. The door closed behind us with a soft click, the kind that usually means the world has been kept out. Cold followed us in, anyway. My daughter stood just inside the entryway, her boots leaving small dark shapes on the wood floor. Snow clung to the seams, melting slowly, quietly. I watched the water spread, thin and clear, like it was trying to disappear before anyone noticed. She didn't look at me right away. She bent down and began to untie her laces. Slowly, one loop at a time. Her fingers were stiff from the cold, moving carefully, like each motion mattered more than usual. The house was quiet in that familiar way. No radio, no ticking clock this time. Just the soft sound of fabric and breath. I leaned against the wall, my coat still on, my hands still numb. "I didn't mean to leave like that," she said. Her voice was calm. Not apologetic. Just honest. "It's all right," I said, even though it wasn't. Even though nothing felt settled. She slid one boot off, then the other. Wet socks met the floor. She didn't seem to mind. The snow kept melting. "I've seen him before," she said. I waited. "At the fence," she went on. "After school. Sometimes early in the morning. Sometimes just before dark." I pictured the field at those hours, the way the light drops low and long, stretching shadows across the snow or the grass depending on the season. I'd always thought the field was empty then. Just space. "How long?" I asked. She paused, thinking. Her fingers brushed dirt from the boot soles, even though they were already clean. "A few weeks," she said. "Maybe longer." The words settled between us. Weeks. That meant afternoons I'd been in the kitchen. Mornings I'd been half awake. Evenings I'd assumed she was safe because she was home on time. "He never crossed," she added. "Not once." She stood and carried the boots to the mat by the door, setting them side by side. "Neat. Careful." "He just stood there," she said. Like the fence was something he'd promised himself not to touch. I moved toward the kitchen, more out of habit than direction. She followed, stopping at the doorway. The floor creaked under her weight, the sound sharp in the quiet room. I poured water into the kettle. Didn't turn it on. "He didn't talk?" I asked. She shook her head. Not at first. She leaned against the counter, crossing her arms, the way she did when she was thinking through something that didn't have an easy answer. "He waited," she said. "Sometimes for a long time." The kettle sat between us, cold and dull. I tried to picture him there. A shape at the edge of the field. Silent. Watching. Waiting. It should have frightened me. It did, in a way that settled low and stayed there. "And you?" I asked. "What did you do?" She shrugged. I watched back. That felt like the truest thing she could have said. "I didn't go closer," she said. "Not for a while." I nodded. I understood that part. Distance can feel like safety, even when it's only a few feet wide. "He felt familiar," she said after a moment. The word lingered. "Like how?" I asked. She searched for it, her eyes moving around the room, landing on small things, the chipped mug on the counter, the window latch, the spot on the wall where the paint never quite matched. "Like someone I'd already met," she said. Or like someone who knew me before I knew myself. My hands tightened around the kettle handle. I didn't lift it. She looked at me then. Not accusing. Just open. "He smiled sometimes," she said. "But not with his eyes." I swallowed. "He never waved," she continued. "Never called out. He just stood there. Same place every time." I imagine the fence line again. How it divides but also connects. How it gives shape to space. "When did he talk?" I asked. "The day it snowed for the first time," she said. "The early one. The kind that doesn't last." I remembered that morning. Thin flakes. Gone by noon. I asked him if he was lost, she said. He said no. He said he'd been exactly where he needed to be. The words didn't sound rehearsed when she said them. Just remembered. "And then?" I asked. She looked down at her hands. They were still red from the cold. He asked me if I was happy, she said. The question surprised me. It shouldn't have. I told him yes, she said. But I didn't know if it was true. The kettle began to hum softly, even though I hadn't turned it on. Just the house settling. Old pipes shifting. He didn't correct me, she said. He just nodded. I leaned back against the counter, feeling the cool through my coat. And you kept going back, I said. She nodded. Because he didn't want anything. That stopped me. He didn't ask questions, she said. Didn't tell me what to think. He just listened. Listening can feel like a gift when you're young. Or when you're lonely. Or when you're standing at the edge of something you don't have words for yet. I told him things, she said quietly. I waited. Not secrets, she said. Just thoughts. Things I didn't know where else to put. The house felt smaller then. Not trapped. Just close. I asked him once why he stayed on the other side, she said. And I asked. She smiled, faintly. He said some lines are easier to respect when you draw them yourself. I closed my eyes for a second. The words felt older than both of us. When did you decide to follow him? I asked. She took a breath. Let it out slow.
This morning, she said.
When I saw him waiting again. In the snow. I pictured the field the way it had looked when I stepped outside.
White.
Quiet. Waiting. I thought, she said, if he was willing to stand out there all that time, the least I could do was meet him halfway. The kettle clicked as it cooled. The sound echoed too loudly. I looked at her then. Really looked at her. The way her shoulders held tension, she didn't know she carried. The steadiness in her eyes that hadn't been there a year ago. You trusted him, I said. She didn't deny it. I don't know why, she said. I just did. Trust isn't logical. It arrives before reasons do. I thought of all the things I hadn't said. All the names I hadn't spoken. All the stories I'd folded away and tucked into corners. She hadn't had that luxury. He felt like someone I'd always known, she said again. Even before I knew who he was. I nodded slowly. Outside, the snow tapped softly against the window. The field was already changing again, smoothing itself out. I didn't mean to scare you, she said. I know, I said. We stood there for a moment, the kitchen holding our quiet like it always did. The wet spot on the floor had nearly dried. The boots sat by the door, melting their last traces into the mat. I realized then that whatever had been waiting at the fence hadn't just been him. It had been this moment, and I wasn't sure yet what we were supposed to do with it. The house had settled into that late morning quiet where even the light feels careful. Snow pressed softly against the windows, muting the world outside, turning everything pale and slow. My daughter sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. Steam lifted and disappeared. I watched it fade, thinking about how some things vanish before you realize they were warm. I didn't tell her where I was going. I just walked down the hallway. The drawer waited where it always had, second from the bottom, left side of the dresser. It hadn't moved. It hadn't changed. The wood still bore the small scratch near the handle, the one I'd made years ago carrying furniture up the stairs alone. I knelt in front of it, my knees protesting the cold floor. For a moment, I rested my hand on the handle. I felt the weight of time through the wood. Then I pulled. The drawer opened with a soft resistance, like it hadn't been used to being asked. Inside, everything was exactly as I'd left it. Old envelopes. A ribbon that had lost its color. Photographs stacked unevenly, their corners turned inward, faces hidden from the light. I picked up the stack carefully, as if they might crumble if I wasn't gentle. The paper was thicker than the pictures we take now. The edges were worn, soft from years of being folded and unfolded, then folded again. I hadn't looked at them in a long time. Not properly. Not all at once. I took the top photograph and unfolded it. There he was. You never forget certain faces. Even when you try. Even when you tell yourself they belong to another life. His eyes were the same as I remembered, quiet, watchful, like he was listening to something no one else could hear. He stood in the picture the way he always stood in real life, one shoulder slightly forward, hands loose at his sides. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed the details. My breath caught, sharp and small. I laid the photograph on the bed and took another. Then another. Different places. Different days. The same posture. The same eyes. Time hadn't softened him. It had just stepped around him. I felt the floor creak behind me. I didn't turn. She stood in the doorway, silent, her presence steady and close. I knew it was her, by the way the air shifted, by the way the room seemed to hold its breath. She didn't ask what I was doing. I picked up one more photograph. This one was older. The paper had yellowed, the image faint. He was younger there, barely more than a boy, but the eyes were unmistakable. I held it up slightly, not offering it, not hiding it. She stepped closer. I felt her behind me, close enough that I could feel her warmth through my sweater. She leaned down just a little, her head near my shoulder. I could hear her breathing. Slow. Even.
She didn't gasp.
She didn't ask who it was. I knew, she said quietly. The words didn't accuse. They didn't comfort. They just existed. I lowered the photograph to my lap. My hands were shaking now. Not badly. Just enough that I noticed. How long? I asked. She thought about it. I could tell by the pause. By the way she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Not all at once, she said. It came together slowly. I nodded. That made sense. Truth often does. She reached out then, touching the edge of the photograph with one finger. She traced the crease where I'd folded it inward. You hit him, she said. It wasn't a question. I tried to, I said. The drawer sat open beside me, its contents exposed. There was no point pretending anymore. He never told me everything, she said. But he didn't lie. I closed my eyes. I saw him standing by the fence again, keeping his distance, respecting a line I'd drawn long before he arrived. I thought I was protecting you, I said. She didn't answer right away. When she did, her voice was gentle. I know. That hurt more than anger would have. I picked up another photograph. This one showed him laughing. I'd forgotten that, too, that he could laugh like that. Unguarded. Almost careless. I didn't want you to carry this, I said. She shifted closer, her shoulder brushing mine. I carried it anyway, she said. I swallowed.
How?
I asked. She sat down on the edge of the bed beside me, close enough that our knees touched. I felt it, she said. The missing piece. The way stories stopped halfway through.
She paused.
And then I saw him. The room felt smaller then. Not trapped. Just full. When you were born, I said, my voice barely there, I told myself I could start over. She looked at me then. Really looked at me. Not like a child. Like someone standing on equal ground. You did, she said. Just not the way you thought. The photographs lay scattered across the bed now, a timeline I hadn't meant to reveal. She studied them quietly, one by one. I watched her face change as she noticed the details, the way his eyes matched hers, the familiar tilt of his head. She smiled once.
Small. Sad.
He always stood the same way, she said. I nodded. He always has. She reached for one photograph and held it longer than the others. I recognized it immediately. The one I'd almost thrown away. The one I'd kept instead, folded inward like a secret. I wondered, she said, if I looked like him. I wanted to tell her she looked like herself, that she didn't need answers to be whole. But answers have their own gravity. I should have told you, I said.
She didn't argue.
Yes, she said. You should have. She said it without cruelty, without triumph, just truth. We sat there together, the house quiet around us. The snow outside had begun to fall harder, tapping softly against the glass. The world continuing on, unaware of what had just been uncovered. She gathered the photographs carefully, smoothing the creases as best she could. She stacked them neatly, like she was putting something back in order. You don't have to hide them anymore, she said. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure where they belonged now. She slid the photographs back into the drawer, leaving it open. I didn't close it. We stood up together. She lingered in the doorway, looking back once more. I didn't mind knowing, she said. I just didn't want to know alone. The words settled into me, heavy and quiet. After she left the room, I sat on the bed a little longer. The open drawer breathed softly at my side. The past no longer folded inward. Outside, the snow kept falling. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to look away. The heater clicked on and off like it couldn't decide if the room deserved warmth yet. Outside, the snow had slowed to a quiet drift, settling into corners, softening the sharp edges of the world. We sat at the small kitchen table, the same one my daughter had done her homework at for years, 3 chairs pulled close, though none of us leaned back. The light above us hummed faintly. It felt like the house was holding its breath. He sat across from us, hands folded together, then unfolding, then folding again. I noticed the way his fingers trembled before I noticed the calm in his voice. "I'll tell you," he said. And for the first time, he didn't look toward the door. I poured coffee, even though none of us had asked for it. The mug warmed my hands, grounding me in the present. My daughter wrapped her palms around hers without lifting it. He didn't touch his at all. "The winter I left," he began, "was colder than I remember admitting." His voice stayed steady, almost practiced. Not rehearsed, just careful. The kind of care you learn when you've gone over a story enough times to know where it hurts. "The snow came early that year," he said. "Heavy.
Wet.
Roads closed faster than anyone expected." He paused, watching the surface of the coffee ripple slightly as the heater clicked again. "I was supposed to leave for a few days," he continued. "Just long enough to clear my head." My daughter didn't interrupt. She leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, chin resting on her hands. She looked like someone listening for a sound she'd been waiting years to hear. He glanced at her once, then back down at his hands. "That night," he said, "everything stacked up at once. The argument, the phone call, the thing I thought I could fix if I just stepped away." He didn't name it. He didn't need to. I watched his hands then, how his fingers tightened together, how the shaking grew more noticeable when he stopped talking. "I didn't leave because I didn't care," he said. "I left because I thought staying would make it worse." The words settled quietly, like snow finding the ground. My daughter nodded once. Not in agreement. In recognition. He went on. "The roads were bad," he said. "I remember the headlights barely cutting through the snow. I remember thinking I'd turn around if it got worse." He smiled faintly. Not with his eyes. "It always gets worse," he said. The room felt smaller. Not crowded. Just full. "I stopped at the edge of town," he continued. "Right where the fence line runs by the old field." My daughter's eyes lifted at that. "I stood there for a long time," he said, watching the snow cover everything. Thinking if I waited long enough, maybe the choice would make itself. His hands shook harder then. He pressed them flat against the table, as if anchoring them. "I didn't turn back," he said. No apology followed. No justification. Just the truth laid out, plain and unadorned. I waited for anger to rise. For something sharp. It didn't. Instead, I felt the weight of that night settle into the room, filling the spaces between us. "I told myself I'd come back when things were calmer," he said. "When I had something useful to say." He looked up then, meeting my eyes. "There's never a right time," he said. My daughter exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding her breath without realizing it. "I kept waiting," he went on. "Days turned into weeks. Weeks into years." He swallowed. And then it felt like too much time had passed to pretend it wouldn't matter. The clock on the wall ticked, loud and insistent. "I watched from a distance," he said quietly. "I knew where you lived. I knew when the lights went on at night." My chest tightened. "I never crossed the line," he added quickly. "I didn't think I had the right." My daughter spoke then, her voice calm. "You waited," she said. He nodded. "I waited." She didn't look at me. She kept her eyes on him, steady, unafraid. "I wanted to explain," he said. "But explanations can sound like excuses when they come too late." His hands were still shaking. "I didn't expect forgiveness," he said. "I just wanted you to know I didn't leave, because you weren't enough." The words hung there, fragile and heavy. My daughter blinked. Once. Twice. She reached for her mug then, lifting it slightly before setting it back down, untouched. I always wondered, she said softly, if it was something I did. The room went still. He leaned forward, urgency breaking through his careful tone for the first time.
No, he said.
Not loudly. Not forcefully. Just certain. Never. She nodded slowly, as if placing that answer where it belonged. I felt something shift then. Not resolve. Not closure. Just movement. He looked at me again, his eyes searching. I know I don't get to ask this, he said, but I hope she doesn't carry the weight I left behind. I thought of the drawer, the photographs, the years of quiet decisions. I think she already has, I said, but she's stronger than we were. My daughter glanced at me then, just briefly. Something passed between us, acknowledgement, maybe. He leaned back in his chair, the story finished. Outside, the snow had stopped. The world felt suspended, like it was waiting to see what we would do next. My daughter stood slowly, pushing her chair back with a soft scrape. I'm glad you told us, she said. He nodded, relief flickering across his face. She hesitated, then added, I don't know what comes after this. He didn't rush to fill the silence. That's okay, he said. Neither do I. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that I couldn't tell what she was deciding. Finally, she spoke. I don't hate you, she said. The words were simple, unadorned. He closed his eyes briefly, like he needed a moment to absorb them.
Thank you, he said.
She turned toward me then, uncertainty flickering for the first time. I realized what she was asking without saying it. Was forgiveness something she could give without me? I stood slowly, feeling the weight of years in my bones. This isn't something we finished tonight, I said. She nodded. But we started it, she said. That felt true. He rose from his chair, careful, as if afraid of breaking something invisible. He paused near the door, hands steady now. I won't push, he said. I'll stay where you can see me. The fence line again. The distance he respected. My daughter nodded once. When the door closed behind him, the house exhaled. We stood together in the kitchen, the table between us, the light still humming softly overhead. Outside, the field lay quiet and untouched. And for the first time, I wondered what forgiveness might look like when it wasn't mine to give alone. The snow had thinned to a fine dusting by the time we stepped outside. Not enough to hide what had already been there. Just enough to soften it. The door closed behind us with a sound that felt final, even though nothing was finished. Cold air settled into my coat, familiar and sharp. The field stretched out ahead, pale and quiet, the fence line cutting across it like a thought I'd learned not to follow all the way through. He waited for me to walk first. I did. Our boots pressed into the snow side by side, two sets of prints moving toward the same place for different reasons. The sound of our steps was small, almost apologetic. Somewhere, a branch cracked under the weight of winter. Otherwise, the morning held still. He stopped where he always stopped. I recognized the place immediately, not because it looked different, but because it didn't. The fence post leaned slightly, the wire pulled tight and humming faintly in the cold. This was the distance he had chosen. Close enough to see. Far enough to keep his hands clean. This feels right, he said. He didn't touch the fence. He never did. I stood beside him, my breath clouding the space between us. I thought of all the times I'd crossed lines without noticing. All the times I'd stayed still when I should have moved. You don't plan to stay, I said. It wasn't an accusation, just a statement. He shook his head slowly.
No.
There was relief in that. And something else. Something like grief. I don't want to disrupt what you've built, he said. I just wanted her to know. I wasn't a ghost. The word lingered longer than it should have. I looked out across the field. The snow lay smooth now, the earlier footprints nearly gone. The land had already begun to forget us. You could have said something sooner, I said. I know, he replied. But sooner didn't feel allowed.
Allowed.
As if time itself had rules we could appeal to. He shifted his weight, hands tucked into his coat pockets. They were steady now. The shaking had passed. I won't ask for anything, he said.
No place.
No name. The fence creaked softly, the sound stretching thin in the cold. "I just have one question," he said. I didn't answer right away. I waited for it. "Did you tell her," he asked, "why I left?" The question settled into me slowly, like cold seeping through fabric. I opened my mouth, closed it again. "No," I said. The honesty surprised me with how little it hurt to say out loud. He nodded.
Once.
No disappointment. No judgment. Just acknowledgement. "I thought as much," he said. I watched his face, waiting for something. Anger, regret, relief. It didn't come. What I saw instead was something quieter. Acceptance, maybe. Or understanding. "I told myself you'd explain it better than I ever could," he said. "That she'd be safer hearing it from you." I swallowed. And instead, he went on gently. "She learned it in pieces." The fence hummed again, wire tightening as the temperature dropped. I thought of my daughter standing in the kitchen, boots melting into the floor. Of the way she'd said she felt it before she knew it. Of how silence fills space whether you intend it to or not.
I didn't know how, I said. He turned to look at me then.
"Really look at me. That doesn't mean you were wrong," he said. The words landed softly.
They didn't absolve me.
They didn't accuse. They just sat there between us. "What does it cost?" he asked quietly. I didn't need clarification. "What does silence cost?" he said. "After all these years?" I looked back toward the house. From here it looked smaller. Still solid.
Still standing.
"It costs time," I said. "And sometimes trust." He nodded. "And children," he added. Not bitter. Just truthful. The wind moved across the field, lifting a thin veil of snow and setting it down again. The world rearranging itself without asking permission. "I thought if I stayed away," I said, "I could keep things simple." He smiled faintly, not with his eyes. "Simple doesn't always mean light," he said. We stood there a moment longer, the fence holding its line. I wondered how many times he'd stood in this exact spot, measuring the distance, reminding himself where he belonged. "She doesn't blame you," I said. He looked surprised. Not hopeful, just surprised. "She's kinder than we were," I added. He exhaled slowly, the breath visible and then gone. "I never wanted her to carry my leaving as a question," he said. "She did," I replied. "But she carried it quietly." That seemed to hurt him more than anger would have. "I'll stay back," he said after a moment. "Where you can see me." The same words he'd used before. The same promise. I nodded. "That's enough," I said. We turned back toward the house together, but only partway. He stopped at the fence. I kept walking. The distance opened between us naturally, the way it always had. Behind me, I could feel him standing there, not following, not disappearing, just present. When I reached the porch, I stopped and looked back. He raised a hand slightly, not a wave. Just an acknowledgement. I went inside. The warmth hit me slowly, the house creaking as it adjusted. My daughter sat at the table, watching the window. She didn't ask anything when I entered. I took off my coat, hung it carefully. "I didn't tell you why he left," I said. She looked at me then, her eyes steady, patient. "I know," she said. The clock ticked on the wall. The kettle rested cold on the stove. Outside, the fence line held firm. The field lay quiet. And somewhere between distance and truth, something waited to be named. The house sounded different at night. Not louder, just more honest. The heater clicked on and off in the hallway, uncertain. Snow pressed softly against the windows, not hard enough to announce itself, just enough to be felt. I stood in the doorway of my daughter's room, watching her reflection in the glass. The lamp behind her cast a warm circle that didn't quite reach the corners. Everything else stayed in shadow, waiting. She was braiding her hair slowly. 3 careful sections. Over. Under.
Pause.
It felt like the house was listening again. She didn't turn when she spoke. "What does family really mean?" she asked. Her voice wasn't sharp. It wasn't hurt. It was curious. I leaned against the doorframe, the wood cool against my shoulder. The question stayed between us, unhurried. Outside, the snow settled deeper, softening the world into something quieter.
Most people say blood, I said.
She nodded, still watching her hands move in the glass. Her fingers were steady, practiced. She'd braided her hair that way since she was little, ever since she'd learned patience before she learned speed. That's what people say, she agreed. Then she shook her head. But I don't think that's it. I didn't answer right away. The floor creaked beneath my weight, a small sound that felt older than both of us. I watched her braid reach the end, watched her tie it off carefully, like she didn't want anything unraveling tonight. What do you think it is? I asked. She shrugged lightly.
Choice.
The word landed quietly, but it stayed. She turned then, just enough to look at me through the reflection instead of directly. Her face was calm, thoughtful. There was no accusation there. No demand. I think family is who stays, she said. Or who comes back. The lamp flickered once, then steadied. Snow slid down the glass in thin, slow lines. I thought of the fence, of distance, of waiting. When did you start thinking about that?
I asked.
She smiled faintly. Not happy, not sad, just aware. A long time ago, she said. I just didn't have words for it yet. She sat on the edge of the bed, smoothing the quilt with her palm. The fabric was worn soft from years of washing, the stitches holding because someone had cared enough to make them that way. I used to think something was wrong with me, she said. Like I was missing something everyone else had. My chest tightened. But then I realized, she went on, missing doesn't always mean broken. Sometimes it just means unfinished. I stepped fully into the room then, closing the door behind me. The sound was gentle, but it felt important. You weren't missing, I said. She looked at me directly this time. Her eyes steady.
Clear.
I know, she said. Now. That word, now, felt heavier than the rest. I sat beside her on the bed, careful not to crowd her. The mattress dipped slightly under our combined weight. The quilt creased where our hands rested close, but not touching. I'm not angry, she said quietly. I believed her. That was the hardest part. I thought I would be, she admitted. But mostly I just feel like I understand things better. Understanding can be gentler than forgiveness. Or more dangerous. I watched you for years, she said. How careful you were. How you chose words. How you didn't choose others. I swallowed. You were protecting me, she said. I know that. The snow outside thickened, the window glowing softly from the light inside. But sometimes, she added, protection can feel like distance. I nodded.
Slowly.
She reached for the end of her braid, rolling it between her fingers. When I met him, she said, I didn't feel confused. That surprised me. She saw it. I felt calm, she said. Like something I'd been wondering about had finally answered me back. She paused, then looked down. He didn't ask me to choose, she said. He just existed. I thought of how he stood by the fence. How he respected lines I hadn't known how to explain. That mattered, she said. Silence filled the room again. Not uncomfortable, just full. I don't think family is something you're born into, she said. I think it's something you decide to keep showing up for. The words pressed against something in me I hadn't wanted to examine too closely. Even when it's hard? I asked. Especially then, she said. She lay back on the bed, staring up at the ceiling. The light cast soft shadows across her face, changing it into something older, something steadier. I don't need things to be perfect, she said. I just need them to be real. I watched her chest rise and fall, watched how calm she was inside all this. Had she already decided what I was still afraid to face? I reached out then, resting my hand on the quilt near hers. Not touching, just close. I didn't know how to explain things, I said. She turned her head toward me. You don't have to explain everything all at once. That felt like permission. She sat up again, tucking one leg beneath her, the other hanging off the side of the bed. I'm not asking you to change everything, she said. I just don't want us to pretend anymore. Pretending. The word lingered. Outside, a gust of wind lifted snow against the house, then let it fall back into place. Do you know what you want? I asked her.
She thought about it.
Really thought. I want honesty, she said. And time. She smiled then, small and sincere. And I want to know that whatever happens next, we choose it. Together. I nodded, feeling something settle into me. Not relief. Not fear. Something steadier. Okay, I said. The word felt right. She leaned forward and rested her head briefly against my shoulder. Just for a moment. Long enough to say something without words. Then she pulled back. Good night, she said. Good night, I replied. I stood and turned off the lamp. The room fell into soft darkness, the snow outside glowing faintly under the moon. As I closed the door behind me, I paused in the hallway, listening to the house breathe. My daughter had asked what family meant. I realized then she wasn't waiting for my answer. She had already found her own. And I wasn't sure yet if I was brave enough to follow her there. The kettle had already boiled itself dry by the time I realized I hadn't moved. It sat on the stove, clicking softly, metal shrinking back into itself. The house was quiet in that way that only comes late at night, when even the walls seem careful about what they remember. I stood there with my hand on the counter, staring at nothing in particular, knowing that once I spoke, something would be gone for good. My daughter sat at the table behind me, waiting. I turned off the stove and carried the kettle to the sink. The sound of cold water hitting hot metal filled the space between us. Steam rose, then vanished. I stayed there a moment longer than necessary, giving myself time I didn't deserve. When I finally sat down across from her, she folded her hands in her lap. Neatly, like she didn't want them to betray her. The light above the table hummed. The clock ticked. I need to tell you something, I said. She nodded once. She didn't say I know. That mattered. I started with the fear, because it was the easiest to name. I was scared, I said. Not of him. Of myself. The words sounded smaller out loud than they had inside me all these years. She didn't react. She just listened, her eyes steady, her face open. I was scared I'd make the wrong choice. I went on. That if I stayed, I'd ruin everything. That if I left, I'd lose you. I swallowed. The floor creaked under my chair, like it remembered every other night I'd sat there avoiding this moment. So, I chose a story that felt safer, I said. She tilted her head slightly. Still quiet. I told myself he left because he wanted to, I said. Because he couldn't handle responsibility. Because that was simpler than admitting I didn't know how to let him stay. The kettle cooled behind me. The house settled. I told her about the nights I lay awake rehearsing conversations I never had. About how I practiced answers to questions she didn't ask yet. About the way shame has a habit of disguising itself as protection. I didn't think you were ready, I said. That was the part that hurt to say. I told myself children don't need complicated truths, I added. That they grow better without loose ends. Her fingers tightened briefly, then relaxed again. But the truth doesn't disappear, I said. It just waits. I talked about the easier story. The one where silence felt like kindness. Where distance felt responsible. Where I could look at myself in the mirror and say I'd done my best. I chose what let me sleep, I said. Not what was honest. The words settled into the room like dust. She didn't interrupt. That was the hardest part. She didn't rush me. She didn't correct anything. She didn't look away when my voice faltered. She stayed exactly where she was, hands folded, shoulders relaxed. Listening like this was something she'd already decided to hear. I told her about the moments I almost spoke. The times her questions came close but not close enough. How I waited for the right moment until all the moments passed. I thought if I held it long enough, I said, it would soften. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It didn't, I said. It just got heavier. The clock kept ticking. I finished with the shame, because it had been there the longest. I was ashamed that I didn't know how to fix it, I said. Ashamed that I'd chosen comfort over courage. My voice stayed steady, even when my hands didn't. I didn't trust myself, I said. So, I didn't trust you. The sentence hung between us, bare and unprotected. When I stopped speaking, the silence didn't rush in. It waited. My daughter shifted slightly in her chair. The fabric of her sweater brushed softly against the table edge. She looked down at her hands, then back up at me. She nodded once. Just once. I wish you had trusted me sooner, she said.
Her voice was calm.
Not wounded. Not accusing.
Honest.
The words landed harder than anger ever could have. I know, I said. She breathed out slowly, like she'd been holding something in for a long time. I think, she said carefully, I always knew there was more. I didn't argue. I could feel it, she went on. In the pauses. In the way you changed the subject. In the things you didn't say. I nodded. Every word felt earned. But I didn't think it was because you didn't believe in me, she said. I thought it was because you were tired. That hurt in a different way.
I was tired, I said.
Just not in the way you deserved. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze drifting toward the window. Snow moved slowly past the glass, catching the light before disappearing into the dark. I don't think you meant to hurt me, she said. I waited. I think you were trying to survive, she added. The kindness in that nearly undid me. I just didn't want to survive, she said quietly. I wanted to understand. I reached across the table then. Not touching.
Just close enough to feel the space.
I'm sorry, I said. She nodded again. Not in forgiveness. In acknowledgement. We sat there for a while, the night deepening around us. The house held the quiet without complaint. Can it still be enough? I asked. The question surprised me as soon as it left my mouth. It sounded smaller than everything else I'd said. She turned back to me, studying my face like she was looking for something specific. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I accepted that. But I think, she continued, that telling me now matters more than never telling me at all. That felt like a door opening. Not wide, but enough to let light in. I don't need you to have been perfect, she said. I just need you to be here. I nodded, the weight in my chest shifting, settling differently. I said. She stood then, pushing her chair back softly. The sound echoed gently in the quiet room. I'm glad you told me, she said. At the doorway, she paused and looked back. We don't have to finish this tonight, she said. But we started it. The words felt familiar. And necessary. After she went to bed, I stayed at the table. The light hummed. The clock ticked. Outside, the snow kept falling, patient and unbothered by human timing. I thought about the easier story, the one I'd carried for so long. How light it had felt compared to the truth. How expensive it had been in ways I couldn't measure until now. Silence had cost me time. And trust. But maybe not all of it. I turned off the light and stood in the dark for a moment, listening to the house breathe. Above me, my daughter moved in her room. A small sound. Proof of presence. I didn't know yet if what I'd given her would be enough. But for the first time in years, I wasn't choosing the easier story. And that felt like the beginning of something I might finally be brave enough to face. The sky was just beginning to lighten when I heard the house settle. Not a sound exactly, more like a shift, the way wood moves when the temperature changes its mind. Dawn pressed faint blue against the windows, careful not to wake anyone too quickly. I stood in the kitchen with my hands around a mug I hadn't filled, listening to the quiet stretch and thin. Outside, the field waited. I knew before I looked that he would be there. The fence cut across the field like it always had, steady and unremarkable. Snow rested on the top rail, undisturbed, as if it had been placed there on purpose. He stood on the far side, shoulders dusted white, his coat darker now against the morning.
He didn't move when he saw us.
He never did. My daughter stepped past me before I could say anything. She didn't pull on a coat.
She didn't hesitate.
Her boots sank softly into the snow as she crossed the porch and walked straight toward him. The cold bit through my sleeves, but I stayed where I was for a moment longer, watching the space open between us. This was something I wasn't meant to interrupt. The air felt thinner out there.
Cleaner.
Each breath showed itself, then disappeared. I followed slowly, my steps heavier, more deliberate. The snow crunched faintly beneath my feet, a sound that felt too loud in the stillness. He waited at the fence, hands loose at his sides. When she reached him, he leaned forward without crossing the line, like he always did. For a moment, they just stood there, close enough to share warmth without touching. Then she stepped closer. She wrapped her arms around him without hesitation, pressing her cheek into his coat. Snow fell from his shoulders onto her hair. He stiffened at first, surprised, then softened, his hands hovering uncertainly before resting lightly against her back. The fence creaked quietly between them. I stopped a few steps away. I didn't move closer. He bent his head toward her and whispered something I couldn't hear. His mouth moved only once. Whatever it was, it belonged to them, not me. She nodded, still holding him, like she was memorizing the shape of that moment. When she stepped back, she didn't wipe her eyes. She wasn't crying. Her face was calm, thoughtful, like someone finishing a sentence she'd been carrying for a long time.
He looked at me then.
There was no apology in his eyes. No request. Just acknowledgement. Like he was saying goodbye to more than one thing at once. I nodded.
That was all there was to say.
He turned away without another word, walking back toward the trees at the edge of the field. His footsteps appeared briefly behind him, dark against the white, then softened as the snow began to fill them in. I watched until he disappeared among the branches. The field felt larger after that. Quieter. My daughter stood beside the fence, her breath slow and even. She didn't look after him for long. She turned toward me instead. "Are you okay?" she asked. The question surprised me. "I think so," I said. She studied my face for a moment, then nodded, as if accepting the answer. We walked back to the house together, side by side. The snow continued to fall lightly, rearranging the ground behind us. By the time we reached the porch, our footprints were already fading. Inside, the warmth came slowly. The house creaked as it adjusted, the familiar sounds settling back into place. My daughter took off her boots and set them neatly by the door. Snow melted onto the mat, darkening the fibers. She hung her scarf carefully, smoothing it flat. I watched her hands. Steady.
Certain.
We stood in the kitchen for a moment without speaking. The kettle sat cold on the stove. Dawn crept farther into the room, touching the edges of the table, the back of the chairs. "He said goodbye," she said quietly. I nodded. "He didn't say it like goodbye," she added. "But that's what it was." I didn't ask what he'd whispered. I knew better. "I think," she said after a pause, "that some people come into our lives to make sure we're not lost." The words stayed with me. "And then they leave," she went on. "So we can walk the rest on our own." I leaned against the counter, feeling the cool through my sweater. "I didn't stop him," I said. She looked at me, surprised. "I know," she said. That mattered. The morning unfolded slowly after that. The day didn't rush us. Snow continued to fall, light and patient, covering what needed to be covered. My daughter moved through the house with a quiet purpose, making tea, opening the curtains, letting the light in. She hummed softly, a sound so small it almost didn't exist. I watched her from the doorway, seeing her the way you do, when you realize something has changed and you're not sure when it happened. She felt older, not hardened, just steadier. Later, when she went to her room, I stood by the window and looked out at the field again. The fence line was still there, unchanged. The trees at the far edge stood dark and close together, holding their secrets. No sign of him now. No footprints. Just snow. I thought of all the times I'd held on too tightly, ideas, stories, fears, believing that keeping something close meant keeping it safe. I wondered how much I'd mistaken control for care. My daughter came back into the room quietly. "He told me," she said, standing beside me, "that loving someone doesn't always mean staying." I felt my throat tighten. "He said sometimes it means knowing when to step back," she added. I nodded, my reflection faint in the glass. She leaned her head briefly against my shoulder. Not long. Just enough.
"Thank you," she said.
"For what?"
I asked. "For letting me decide," she said.
The words landed softly, but they stayed. That evening, the snow finally stopped. The world outside looked smoothed and settled, like it had been given a second chance. The fence cut its familiar line across the field, holding its place. I stood there a long time, watching the light fade, thinking about the things we hold and the things we release. Was letting go the last thing I needed to learn? I wasn't sure. But as I turned away from the window, I felt something loosen inside me. Not loss, not relief, but space. And for the first time, I wondered what might grow there if I didn't try to fill it too quickly. The field looked untouched by afternoon.
Smooth. Pale.
Whole again. I stood at the window with my hand resting against the glass, watching light move slowly across the snow. The morning's footprints were gone. Every one of them. Not covered. Not blurred. Just erased, like they'd never been there at all. The world had a way of doing that when you weren't looking. Behind me, the house breathed quietly. No kettle. No clock loud enough to notice. Just space. The afternoon light settled low and wide, stretching across the field until even the fence softened at the edges. Snow clung to the rails, balanced there as if unsure whether to stay or fall. I stayed where I was, letting the stillness reach me slowly, the way cold does when you stop moving. My daughter came to stand beside me without a sound. I felt her before I saw her, the air shifting slightly as she leaned close. She folded her arms, resting them lightly against the window frame, her breath fogging the glass for a moment before clearing again. The house felt different now. Not empty, just quiet in a new way. I used to think, she said softly, that family was about who stayed. Her voice didn't ask for agreement. It offered something instead. I didn't turn from the window. I watched the field hold its shape. But now, she went on, I think it's about who comes back. I felt the words settle into me, slow and deliberate. When it matters, she added. The snow outside shifted slightly as the wind moved through it, a faint ripple that smoothed itself out almost immediately. Nothing disturbed the surface for long. I reached for her hand, without thinking. My fingers found hers easily, like they remembered the way. Her hand was warm.
Solid. Real.
She squeezed once. Not reassurance. Just presence. The house creaked softly, adjusting as the afternoon cooled. Somewhere above us, a pipe knocked once, then settled. These sounds had always been there. I just hadn't been listening for them before. I don't feel angry anymore, she said. I turned to look at her then. She was watching the field, her expression thoughtful, calm. I don't think I ever really was, she said. I was just waiting. For what? I asked. She shrugged lightly. For things to make sense. I nodded. That felt honest. Outside, the fence line held steady, dividing nothing in particular. Snow had filled the gaps beneath it, blurring where the land ended and the air began. We stood there a long time, without speaking. The light changed gradually, the way it always does, inching toward evening. Shadows lengthened. The world slowed. I thought about all the winters that had come and gone without me noticing what they took with them. The stories that ended quietly. The questions that stopped asking themselves. Silence had a way of rearranging things. What do you think winter does? She asked suddenly. When it's finished with us. The question surprised me. I think it takes what we don't need anymore, I said after a moment. She considered that. And leaves the rest? She asked. Sometimes, I said. She smiled faintly. Not with her eyes. Just enough to acknowledge the thought. Later, when the light had thinned and the field began to darken, she leaned her head against my shoulder. The contact was brief but certain, like she didn't need to hold on for long to know I was there. I'm glad he came back, she said. I felt the words move through me, not painful, not comforting, just true. Me too, I said. Even if I hadn't known I would be. The day ended the way it always did, slowly, without ceremony. Snow reflected the last of the light until the field glowed faintly, then dulled as evening settled in. The fence became a dark line again, its shape familiar. No footprints appeared. None were needed. I watched the field until the glass cooled beneath my palm, until the house behind us filled the silence again. When she finally stepped away from the window, I stayed a moment longer. I thought about what had been carried away by the winter. The easier stories, the rehearsed silences, the fear of saying the wrong thing too late. I wondered what might return instead. Trust, maybe. Or patience. Or the courage to leave space where answers hadn't arrived yet. I turned from the window and followed her down the hallway. The floor creaked softly beneath my steps, like it remembered every other time I'd walked this way unsure of what waited ahead. This time, the uncertainty didn't feel heavy. Just open. That night, after the house went still, I stood once more at the window. Snow fell again, light, unhurried. It covered nothing urgent. It erased nothing important. The field accepted it quietly. I rested my forehead against the glass, letting the cold steady me. Somewhere inside the house, my daughter slept. The sound of her breathing drifted faintly through the walls, a reminder that some things remain even when the world smooths itself over. What other truths had the winter finally carried away?
I didn't know.
But for the first time, I wasn't afraid to let the season answer in its own time.